mistake.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I'm wondering whether or not that kind of concern doesn't ring more in like a due process claim rather than just compensation. Because to the extent you're arguing about, or your claim is that they needed to do other steps before they took the property, I didn't understand the takings clause to be concerned about pre-takings deprivation, that the takings clause was just about just compensation. And so wouldn't you be needing to bring a kind of a due process type claim if you're complaining about the personal property aspect of this?
We would acknowledge that due process comes awful close in the just compensation world, but the question that's being challenged here is, does the result of this foreclosure process result in just compensation?
Yes, no, I know that, but I'm saying to the extent in the context of just compensation, we're now thinking just for the moment about what happened before this taking. I wonder whether just compensation is the right analytical framework to evaluate that. It doesn't seem to me to be, and I know you're not making that argument here, but I'm just sort of responding to the thought that if there is some sort of problem with what the government was supposed to do before the taking, we should not be thinking of that as a just compensation issue.
It is possible that a due process aspect of this can.
All right, on the just compensation issue, I guess the thing that I'm really struggling with is the notion that just compensation is necessarily always tied to the fair market value. And you've said it many times, but I'm wondering if it doesn't also have to account for the circumstances under which this sale is taking place. So we have your client, Mr. Pung, who had this house, but he also didn't pay his taxes. And kind of going with what Justice Alito was saying, piggybacking on it, I suppose there are things he could have done to cover his tax bill. So the government is coming in at the beginning to foreclose on this house for the payment of his debt. Given that circumstance, I guess I don't understand why your argument doesn't kind of turn the government into Mr. Pung's real estate agent with some sort of fiduciary duty to maximize the value of this asset. The government's only real interest in this is covering its tax liability. And if Mr. Pung wanted to get the maximum value of the house to cover that debt, he could have sold it himself and gotten the fair market value on the day that you say, you know, the government came, I think, to foreclose on it. So having chosen not to do that, forcing the government to sell his house, I guess I'm worried about suggesting that he can come back after the fact and say, no, you didn't do enough to get the maximum price. All they have to do is just give him the excess of what they sell it for. And that should be the end of it, I think, conceptually. So tell me why I'm wrong about that.
So I'm going to take a half step back and then a full step forward to say that what the Fifth Amendment requires to reach just compensation, if you're going to trigger this process, because there's no obligation to do a tax foreclosure in these. This is voluntary on the part of the government itself.
But only insofar as they're responding to his delinquency. So his delinquency is the beginning. Like you haven't really focused on that, but the first thing is, Mr. Pung, pay your taxes. And when he doesn't, the government has several options to try to figure out what to do. One of them is, okay, you have this other property, whether it's real property or personal property, we are going to foreclose on it. If Mr. Pung says, please don't, because my house is worth $100,000, and if you put it into a tax sale, it's only going to get $70,000, he can sell the house and get the $100,000 and pay the tax bill. The government doesn't care about that.
But
why didn't he do that?
Well, first of all, he didn't do that because he didn't owe the tax, which has been one of the underlying aspects of this.
Well, we have to assume that for the purpose of this, right?
But I would agree. But the point I guess I would come back to at the start of your question on this would be is that in a tax foreclosure takings context, the obligation of the government under Cherokee Nation is to have reasonable, certain, and adequate provisions to reach just compensation.
Right, and the just compensation is the difference between what the government was forced to sell his house at on the tax sale and what he owed in taxes. So they gave it back to him, right? They sold it for $70,000 or whatever it was, gave it back to him, and I would think they're done. You're saying they had an obligation to not sell it for the 70 or to reach into the public fist and pay the difference between the 70 and what it would have sold in a fair market scenario, and I don't understand where that comes from.
That where it comes from is the obligation that if you're taking property, which is here, the property interest is not the auction proceeds. The property interest here is the value of the equity that was taken.
One last time. They're not taking property like a person who, like a government who wants to build a railroad. The government wants to have a sidewalk or a park. They're taking property because he didn't pay his taxes. And so to me, that context makes the just compensation analysis different.
Respectfully, I would say that...
You disagree?
I disagree. Okay. I guess I would finish by saying is that takings law doesn't turn on moral fault. And the reality is the balance...
But I thought we were doing just compensation.
Well,
there is equity in this.
But the balance of the fairness was decided at the adoption of the Fifth Amendment. The trade-offs between the government and the citizen was already weighed, and the obligation was put on the government by putting just compensation obligations on the government itself.
Thank you, counsel.